Her late father left her a dry well. August Crawl, who had survived 11 Black Hills winters and buried 2 drivers to the cold, told her, "Keep sleeping over that hole and they'll haul you out stiff by New Year." She had $46, no second pair of hands, and no way to haul 4 months of food. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature crashed 24 degrees in hours. But 5 months earlier, Eva Penrose had never braced a shaft timber in her life. She had arrived in Lawrence County in the first week of August, 1887, with a trunk that held 3 dresses, a feather tick, a cookpot, and $46 after burial costs. The stagecoach driver had left her at the switchback below Cedar Draw with directions that amounted to up the bench, last acre before the timberline. He had not offered to carry her trunk. She had dragged it herself, one arm burning, until she reached the place her father had spent 10 years trying to make into something. The acre looked like a curse, dressed as a gift. A half-finished shack frame sat crooked against the afternoon sun, its pine planks warped from seasons of neglect. Spoil rock lay scattered in strange, low terraces that might have been windbreaks or might have been the work of a man who had stopped caring where he threw dirt. A scatter of rusted tools leaned against a shed that had no door, and at the center of it all, ringed by packed earth and a collar of flat stones, sat the mouth of the dry well. Eva Penrose stood at the edge of it and looked down into darkness. She had heard about this hole her entire adult life. To her, her father's letters had mentioned it the way other men mentioned crops or cattle, always with progress, never with completion. "The well is coming along. I went down another 4 feet this week. The water will come." But no water ever came. The letters stopped mentioning it after 1883, which was when the neighbors had started calling Martin Penrose mad. Now Martin was in the ground, and Iva was standing over the thing that had swallowed his last decade. She kicked a pebble into the shaft. The sound took a long time to reach bottom. The first visitor arrived before sundown. August Crawl walked the acre with the unhurried confidence of a man who had seen 100 homesteads fail and expected to see 100 more. He was 54 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a beard that had gone white at the edges and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood as his freight wagons. He had hauled goods through 11 Black Hills winters. He had buried 2 drivers after the long winter of 1880 to 81. He knew what cold could do to a person who was not ready for it. He stopped at the well collar and looked down the same shaft Eva had been staring at for the past hour. "Your father dug this," he said. It was not a question. 10 years, Iva said. "Never hit water." "No." Crawl nodded slowly. He walked the perimeter of the acre, kicking at the spoiled terraces, examining the half-finished shack, counting the split wood that Martin had left stacked against the shed. When he came back to Iva, his face held the kind of expression a doctor wears before delivering news that cannot be softened. "You know what you need to survive a winter up here?" Iva said nothing. "You need a tight cabin. You have half a frame." He pointed at the shack. "You need 6 cords of split pine, minimum. You have maybe 1.5. He pointed at the wood stack. "You need flour, beans, salt pork, lamp oil, enough to last from first snow until the road opens again. That's 4 months if the winter is kind, 5 if it isn't." He paused. "You have $46. $46 and whatever my father left." Crawl laughed. It was not a cruel sound, but it was not kind either. It was the laugh of a man who had watched hope die so many times that he no longer felt anything when he saw it happen. "Your father left a hole in the ground that never made water." He walked to the well collar and looked down again. "A hole that never made water won't make bread. You cannot burn it for heat. You cannot trade it for flour. It is nothing but a grave waiting to be filled. Eva felt the words land like stones in her chest. She had spent the entire stagecoach journey telling herself there would be something. Her father had not been a stupid man. Eccentric, yes. Stubborn, certainly, but not stupid. He would not have spent 10 years digging a useless hole. Would he? What do you suggest I do? She asked. Kral shrugged. Sell. Orin Kels has been eyeing this acre for a freight shed. He'll give you $60 for it, maybe 70 if you negotiate. Take the money, go back to Whitewood, find work as a seamstress or a cook. You might survive the winter that way. And if I stay? The freight hauler's eyes found hers. He held her gaze for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something quieter, something that might have been pity. Keep sleeping over that hole and they'll haul you out stiff by New Year. He turned and walked back down the bench road without looking back. Eva spent the first night in the half-finished shack, wrapped in her feather tick, listening to the wind move through the gaps in the walls. She did not sleep. The arithmetic August Kral had done kept running through her head, and no matter how she arranged the numbers, they came out the same. 6 cords of wood. She had 1.5, 4 months of food. She had money for perhaps 6 weeks. A tight cabin. So she had walls without a roof, and a roof frame without walls. A horse or mule. She had her own 2 hands. The math was impossible. Every way she worked it, the answer was the same. She would run out of something critical before spring: money, food, fuel, time. The question was only which shortage would kill her first. She could sell. Orin Kels would buy the acre. She could take his money and go back to Whitewood, find a room in a boarding house, hire out her needle and her ledger keeping until something better came along. It was the sensible choice. It was the choice every person on this bench expected her to make. But selling meant admitting that her father had been mad. It meant agreeing with every whispered judgment, every knowing look, every pitying shake of the head that had followed the news of Martin Penrose's death. It meant accepting that he had wasted 10 years of his life digging a hole that meant nothing, and it meant giving up the only thing he had ever tried to give her. Iva sat in the darkness and listened to the wind and made a decision that she knew was probably foolish. She would not sell. Not yet. She would give herself 2 weeks to understand what her father had been doing. If the acre truly held nothing but a dry well in a broken shack, she would accept it and go. But if there was something else, something she had missed, something the neighbors had never understood, she wanted to find it. 2 weeks. Then she would decide. She started with salvage. The plan was simple: pull usable stone from the dry well's lining, haul it up, and use it to shore the foundation of the shack. Stone was heavy, but it was free. Morris said she needed to save every penny of her $46 for things she could not make herself. On the morning of her 3rd day, Iva tied a rope to the well collar, lit a tallow lamp, and lowered herself into the shaft. The descent was harder than she expected. The walls were rough stone fitted without mortar, slick in places with moisture that had no business being there if the well was truly dry. The rope burned her palms. The lamp swung and cast shadows that made the stones look like they were moving. By the time she reached the bottom, 28 feet down by her count of the rope knots, her arms were shaking and her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She held up the lamp and looked around. The shaft ended in packed earth. No water, no spring, just dirt and stone and the smell of cold clay. August Kral had been right. The well was dry. Her father had dug for 10 years and found nothing. She was about to start climbing back up when the lamp caught something at the edge of her vision. Behind her, set into the wall of the shaft at chest height, there was a darkness that was darker than the rest. Not stone, not earth. Something else. Eva moved closer, held up the lamp, and felt her breath stop in her throat. It was a door, an iron-banded pine plank door set into the dirt and rock behind hanging roots and packed clay. The iron was rusted but still solid. The wood was dark with age, but not rotten. Someone had built this door, fitted it carefully into the side of the shaft, and then covered it with earth and roots to hide it from anyone looking down from above. Her father had built this door. Her father, who everyone said was mad, had spent 10 years digging a hole, and then at the bottom of that hole he had built a hidden door. Iva's hands were trembling as she set down the lamp and began to pry at the packed clay around the threshold. The earth came away in chunks, revealing more of the door frame, more of the iron bands, more of the carefully fitted planks. Her fingernails tore. Her shoulders burned. She did not stop. When she finally had enough clearance, she grabbed the iron handle and pulled. The door resisted. She pulled harder. Rust screamed against rust. The hinges groaned, and then it opened. Cold air breathed out, not the damp cold of a root cellar, something steadier, something that had been waiting in darkness for a very long time. Eva picked up her lamp and stepped through. So the chamber was larger than she'd imagined anything underground could be. 14 feet by 16, roughly, with a low ceiling that cleared her head by perhaps a foot. The walls were shored with pine timbers, old but solid, fitted in the way she had seen mine tunnels supported in photographs. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. Along the walls stood shelves, bins, hanging pegs, and stacked barrels. And on those shelves, in those bins, on those pegs, food, potatoes, hundreds of them, resting in dark wooden bins. Carrots and beets packed in sand and sawdust, onion strings hanging in one corner where the air was driest, grain in sealed barrels, cured meat hanging from hooks driven into the ceiling timbers. Eva walked through the chamber in a daze, her lamp casting long shadows across stores that should not have existed. She touched the potatoes. Cold, firm, not rotted. She pressed her hand to a barrel and felt the cool weight of grain inside. She lifted a string of onions and smelled the sharp, clean scent of something preserved exactly as it should be. On one of the cap timbers, penciled in her father's handwriting, she found dates, weights, and a single rule written larger than the rest. Never trust one temperature for every food. She stood in the center of the chamber and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Her father had not been mad. He had not been digging a well. He had been building something else entirely, a storage vault, sunk deep below the frost line, designed to keep food through winters that killed everything stored above ground. And he had filled it. Eva counted. 48 sacks of potatoes, 12 barrels of grain, 8 strings of onions, 60 pounds of cured pork and beef, by her rough estimation, carrots and beets enough to fill a wagon, 5 tons of food, maybe more, enough to survive a winter, enough to survive 2 winters if she was careful, enough to change everything. The practical skeptic arrived on the 5th day. Dileia Voss was 34, a widow who ran a rough boarding kitchen when the freight wagons came through. She was not a cruel woman, she was simply a practical one, the kind who had buried a husband to cholera and learned that hope was a luxury she could not afford. She found Iva hauling sawdust from behind the shed and stopped to watch with arms crossed. "People are talking," Dileia said. Iva did not look up. "People always talk. They say you've been climbing in and out of that dry well like you found gold at the bottom. No gold." "Then what?" Eva straightened and wiped sawdust from her hands. She studied Delia's face for a long moment, weighing trust against risk. Telling anyone about the chamber was dangerous. But Delia had survived winters on this bench. She might understand what Iva had found, and more importantly, she might understand why it mattered. My father wasn't digging a well, Eva said. Delia's eyebrows rose. No? He was building a storage chamber, below the frost line, deep enough that the temperature stays steady year-round. A root cellar. Larger than a root cellar, large enough to hold 5 tons of preserved food. Delia was silent for a long moment. Her expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a calculation being performed, a judgment being reserved. And you're saying it's full? She asked. Full enough. Full enough to survive a winter? Full enough to survive 2, if I can keep it working. Delia walked to the well collar and looked down. She stood there for a long time, her face unreadable. When she turned back to Iva, her voice had gone flat. Your father spent 10 years building a pantry in a grave, she said. And now you're planning to live off it. Yes. You know what a grave does in winter? It stays cold. It stays cold, and it stays sealed, and it stays dark. And when the snow piles up and the rope freezes and the timber cracks, everything in it rots or freezes or gets crushed. Delia shook her head slowly. Food underground can spoil. Gas can build. Timbers can give way. One slip on that rope, and they'll find you at the bottom come spring, and they'll say you died just as mad as your father. Eva felt the words land. They were not wrong. Every concern Delia raised was real. The chamber could fail. The timbers could crack. She could fall, break a leg, freeze to death in the dark before anyone came looking. But she had seen what was down there. She had touched the potatoes and felt their firmness. She had smelled the clean, cold air. Her father had not been mad. He had been building something that worked. I know the risks, Eva said. Do you? Delia stepped closer. Have you ever braced a timber, sealed a vent, managed humidity in a closed space? Do you know what happens when carrots sit too long in wet sand? Do you know how to check if air is still moving or if you're breathing the last of it? No. Eva met Delia's gaze. But I'm going to learn. Delia stared at her for a long moment. Then she shook her head again and turned to leave. A pantry and a grave, she said over her shoulder, is still a grave. The warning did not stop Eva. It made her work faster. She spent the next 3 days in the chamber, mapping what her father had built. The ventilation system was simple but clever. 2 pipes, one high and one low, running through packed earth to the surface. The high pipe exhausted stale air. The low pipe pulled fresh air in. As long as both remained clear, the chamber would breathe. But one of the pipes was clogged with root growth. Iva spent half a day on her knees, reaching up into darkness with a hooked iron rod, Sue pulling out tangles of dead vegetation until air began to move again. When she finally emerged, her arms were scratched from wrist to shoulder, and her lungs ached from holding her breath in the close space. She learned the bins, potatoes in the darkest corner, far from any light that might turn them green. Carrots and beets in sand and sawdust, checked weekly for soft spots. Onions in the driest section, where moisture would not make them sweat and rot. Grain sealed tight against moisture and vermin. Meat hung away from the root bins, where the faint warmth of vegetable respiration could not speed its decay. She learned the temperatures. The chamber stayed cool, not cold enough to freeze, not warm enough to spoil. Her father's notes on the cap timber showed he had tracked this for years, recording temperatures at different depths in different seasons. The pattern held. Below the frost line, weather lost its power. The earth itself became the insulator. She learned the math. 48 sacks of potatoes at roughly 60 pounds each, 2,880 pounds, 12 barrels of grain, each holding perhaps 200 pounds, 2,400 more, carrots, beets, onions, meat, another 1,000 pounds at least, over 5 tons. Her father had not been hoarding, he had been preparing. But preparing for what? The answer arrived with Orin Kels. He came on the 8th day walking up the bench road with the easy confidence of a man who owned more than he had built. Orin Kels was 43, the only real storekeeper on Cedar Draw, the man who held credit for half the families on the bench. And he lent at hard terms and collected without mercy. He had been watching the Penrose acre for years, waiting for Martin to die or give up. Now Martin was dead, and Orin had come to collect. Miss Penrose, he tipped his hat with a smile that did not reach his eyes. I came to pay my respects. Your respects? Eva set down the hammer she had been using to shore a sagging corner of the shack frame. 8 days after the funeral. Business kept me, you understand? He looked around the acre with the same appraising gaze August Crawl had used, but there was something hungrier in it, something that saw value where others saw failure. I heard you've decided to stay. For now. Bold. He walked to the well collar and peered down. Your father's famous dry well. The whole bench used to wonder what he was looking for. Water. Presumably. Orin's smile widened slightly. Though some said he was digging for something else, some said he was hiding things down there, tools he'd borrowed and never returned, goods that went missing from freight wagons. He turned back to Eva. You haven't found anything like that, have you? The question hung in the air like a blade. Iva felt her heart beating faster, but she kept her face still. Orin did not know about the chamber. He could not know. No one had seen her enter it. No one had seen her carry supplies, but sawdust on her skirt, lamp oil on her hands, the fact that she was buying fewer groceries than a woman alone should need. Small things, but Orin Kels made his living noticing small things. My father left what he meant to leave, Iva said. I'm sure he did. Orin's voice had gone silky. But some things that are left become debts when old bills surface. Your father bought on credit, lamp oil, salt, iron fittings. He never paid off his ledger completely. How much? $12, 40 cents. Eva's stomach tightened. She had $46. Losing 12 would cut her margin to nothing. I'll pay it, she said, by the end of the month. Of course you will. Orin glanced at the well again, then back at Iva. His eyes were calculating. If you find yourself unable to pay, if circumstances become difficult, I want you to know that my offer still stands. $70 for the acre, and you walk away clean. I'll keep that in mind. Orin tipped his hat again and walked back down the bench road. Eva watched him go and felt a new weight settle onto her shoulders. He knew something. He did not know what, but he knew she had found something worth guarding, and now he would be watching. The first setback came 3 days later. Eva had been working to reinforce the chamber's cap timbers, the horizontal beams that held the roof in place. 2 of them showed cracks running through the grain, the kind of cracks that came from years of pressure and moisture. If they failed, the ceiling would come down. She would be buried alive in the place her father had built to save her. She had no idea how to replace them. In Whitewood, she had kept ledgers and sewn hems. She had never braced a mine tunnel. She had never calculated load-bearing stress. She had never held a beam in place while fitting a new support, knowing that one wrong move could bring everything crashing down, but there was no one to teach her. No one who would help a woman that half the bench expected to fail. No one who knew how underground storage actually worked. She would have to learn herself. Eva spent 3 days studying her father's timbers. She measured angles. She tapped wood with a hammer and listened to the sound, trying to understand the difference between solid grain and a dead, hollow core. She practiced on the surface, driving test posts into the ground and loading them with stones until she understood how weight distributed along a vertical support. On the 4th day, she went down into the chamber with a new timber, a hammer, and a prayer. The work was terrifying. The cracked beam groaned when she knocked the first wedge free. Dust rained into her hair. The lamp flickered as air shifted. She felt the entire ceiling pressing down on her, held in place by wood that might give at any moment. She drove the new support into place, wedged it tight, moved to the second position, and repeated the process. When she finally climbed out, her arms were shaking so badly she could barely grip the rope. But the ceiling had held. She had replaced her first timber. The victory was small, but it changed something. Eva began to believe she might actually survive, not through luck or charity, but through learning. Her father had built this chamber using skills she did not have, but skills could be acquired, knowledge could be earned. She was 27 years old, alone, with $46 and 5 tons of food buried in darkness. If she could learn to maintain what he had built, she might live to see spring. The weather was already turning. September had brought cold nights and frost warnings. The leaves on the aspens were going yellow. August crawled past her on the bench road one afternoon and stopped to check on her progress. "Still here," he said. It was not quite a question. "Still here." He looked at the shack. She had managed to finish the walls and start on the roof, working alone with borrowed tools and scavenged materials. The structure was rough, but solid enough to keep out wind. "You've done more than I expected," he admitted. "I've had good weather." "Weather won't hold?" He looked at the sky, reading something in the clouds that Iva could not see. "First hard freeze comes in 6 weeks, maybe less. After that, the road turns bad. After that, you're stuck with whatever you've got." "I know." He studied her for a long moment. The judgment in his eyes had not softened, but there was something else there now, curiosity perhaps, or the first flicker of uncertainty. "You're not buying as much food as you should be," he said. Delia noticed. Orin noticed. People talk. Let them talk. "They're saying your father must have left more than a dry well." Eva said nothing. "If that's true," Kral said slowly, "and I'm not saying it is, but if that's true, you might want to be careful. Orin Kels has a way of finding reasons to claim what isn't his. Your father had debts. A smart man could turn debts into liens, turn liens into seizure." He turned and walked back down the road without waiting for a response. Eva watched him go and felt the clock ticking louder. 6 weeks until first freeze. $12 owed to Orin Kels. A hidden chamber that half the bench was starting to suspect existed. She had to work faster. The next 3 weeks became a blur of labor. Eva checked the chamber every other day, descending into darkness with her lamp and her father's notes. She tested potatoes for soft spots. She turned carrots in their sand beds to prevent rot on the undersides. She opened the grain barrels one by one, checking for moisture or vermin. She cleared the vent pipes weekly, learning which roots grew fastest and which could be left alone. Above ground, she split wood until her palms cracked and bled. 2 cords, 2.5, 3. She stacked them against the shack wall, building a windbreak that would also serve as a fuel reserve. Her shoulders ached constantly. Her back seized up in the mornings. And she had to stretch for 20 minutes before she could stand straight. She paid off Orin's debt, $12.40, and watched her margin shrink to almost nothing. She bought lamp oil, salt, and thread with what was left. The rest would have to come from the chamber, and every day she felt the season turning. The nights grew longer. The frost came earlier, lingering on the grass until mid-morning. The aspen leaves turned gold, then orange, then fell. The wind off the ridge had teeth now, biting through her father's old canvas coat that she had started wearing because her own sleeves were shredded from rope burns. Boys from the settlement came one afternoon, daring each other to look down the dry well. Eva chased them off with sharp words, but she saw the curiosity in their eyes. The word was spreading. Now people were starting to wonder. That night she covered the well collar with planks and weighted them with stones. It would slow her access, but it would also slow anyone else's. The clock kept ticking. First frost came early, 2 days before she had finished her third cord of wood, and the road was already getting bad. She was running out of time. Eva stood at the edge of her acre as October bled into November and counted what she had. 3 cords of split pine, half what she needed, but enough to burn carefully. A tight shack with a small iron stove that her father had left in the shed. A hidden chamber full of food that no one else could access. And no idea whether any of it would be enough. The vent had clogged twice more since she'd cleared it. The second cap timber was starting to crack despite her repairs. The rope that lowered her into the shaft was fraying where it rubbed against the collar stones. Every system had weaknesses she did not know how to fix. She needed help. Real help. Someone who understood how underground spaces worked, how to shore them properly, how to keep food preserved through months of darkness. But there was no one. The bench held farmers, freight haulers, cooks, and clerks. No one had built anything like her father's chamber. No one knew the first thing about mine engineering or subsurface construction. She was alone with 5 tons of food and no way to guarantee she could access it when the snow came. The wind picked up. Somewhere down the bench, a dog barked. Eva went inside, lit her lamp, and sat down with her father's notes. There had to be something in them she had missed. Some hint about reinforcement. Some explanation of how he had learned to do what he did. She read until her eyes burned and the lamp began to gutter. She found nothing. The next morning, she went back down into the chamber. The air was colder than it had been a week ago. Not freezing, not yet, but the edge of cold had sharpened. She checked the vent pipes and found them clear. She checked the potatoes and found them firm. She checked the cap timbers and found the second crack had widened by another 1/8 of an inch. She was running out of time to learn. Iva climbed back out and sat at the collar, staring at the mountains that rose beyond the timberline. Snow was already visible on the highest peaks. In 6 weeks, maybe 4, that snow would reach her. And she still did not know enough. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what her father would have done. He had been a mine laborer before the war. He had set timbers in underground spaces far more dangerous than this one. He had known things she did not know. But he had also been alone, stubborn, unwilling to ask for help even when he needed it. And in the end, the loneliness had killed him. Eva opened her eyes. She would not make the same mistake. The help came from an unexpected direction. Marin Travaran arrived on her acre 3 days after the first hard frost, walking with the uneven gait of a man whose left foot no longer worked the way feet were supposed to work. He was 58 years old, Cornish by birth, with a chest that rattled when he breathed and hands that still remembered how to hold a hammer, even when the rest of him was failing. He had heard about the strange work at the Penrose place. Underground work. The kind of work that traveled through mining country faster than gossip, because men who had spent their lives in tunnels paid attention when someone started moving earth. Eva was checking the vent pipes when she heard him call down the shaft. "You've got the wrong angle on your intake." She looked up. A face peered over the collar, weathered, sharp-eyed, framed by a beard that had gone more gray than brown. "Who are you?" she called back. "Name's Trevarthen. I set timbers for 23 years before the rock dust got my lungs and a cave-in got my foot." He coughed, a wet sound that echoed down the shaft. "I know a mine chamber when I see one. Your father never dug for water, did he?" Eva climbed up slowly, watching the stranger's face. He did not have the hungry look that Orin Kels carried. He did not have the pitying judgment of August Crawl. His expression was something else entirely, curiosity mixed with recognition, as if he had found an answer to a question he had been asking for a long time. "No," she said when she reached the top. "He didn't dig for water." Trevarthen nodded slowly. "He dug below weather. I saw it the moment I looked down. The angle of your walls. The way you've got the collar stones set. That's mine work, not well work." He studied her face. "You didn't build it." "My father built it. And you're trying to keep it running." "Yes." "Do you know what you're doing?" The question cut deeper than he probably intended. Eva felt the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her, the cracked timbers, the clogged vents, the fraying rope, the endless calculations that never quite added up. No," she admitted. "I don't." Trevarthen was silent for a long moment. Then he lowered himself carefully to sit on the collar stones, favoring his bad foot, and looked out at the mountains. "Your father," he said, "Martin Penrose. I met him once, maybe 6 years back. He was buying timber from the mill, asking questions about load weights and support angles. I thought he was building a barn." He laughed, which turned into another cough. "He wasn't building a barn. No. He was building that." Trevarthen jerked his chin toward the shaft. "And he did it right, from what I can see. The chamber's sound. The ventilation's clever. The depth is correct for this climate. You're below the frost line, which means your temperature holds steady while everything above ground freezes or bakes." He paused. But the work's not done." Eva felt something shift in her chest. Hope, maybe, or the first loosening of the knot that had been tightening since she arrived. "What do you mean?" "I mean your father built a good chamber, but he built it alone. One man, working alone, makes choices that work for one man. He knows where every weakness is, so he works around them. But he's dead now, and you don't know where the weaknesses are." Trevarthen fixed her with a look that was not unkind, but was absolutely serious. "Your second cap timber is cracking. Your rope is fraying at the collar. Your intake angle is wrong. You're pulling air from the wrong direction, which means when the wind shifts in winter, you'll get backflow and your chamber will sweat." "How do you know all that?" "Because I spent 23 years underground. And I know what kills a chamber." He stood, slowly, wincing as weight settled on his bad foot. "I also know what keeps one alive." The first lesson came that afternoon. Trevarthen descended into the chamber with Iva, moving carefully on the rope, his bad foot finding purchase on the stone lining with a caution that spoke of old injuries and older memories. When he reached the bottom, he stood in the center of the space and simply listened. "What do you hear?" he asked. Eva listened. The chamber was quiet. The flame of her lamp flickered slightly in the moving air. "Nothing," she said. "Wrong." Trevarthen moved to the wall, pressed his palm flat against one of the cap timbers, and knocked with his knuckles. A solid, resonant sound. He moved to the next timber and knocked again. The same sound. Then he moved to the cracked one, the second cap timber, the one Iva had been worrying about for weeks, and knocked. The sound was different, duller, deader. "You hear that?" he asked. "It sounds hollow." It sounds like a timber that's dying from the inside out. The crack you can see is just the surface. Inside, the grain is separating. The wood is losing its strength. He knocked again, and this time Iva could hear it clearly, the emptiness where solidity should have been. That timber has maybe 6 weeks before it fails, maybe less if the weight shifts. Can it be replaced? Can be, has to be. Travaran moved along the wall, knocking on each timber in sequence. Solid, 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 slightly hollow, solid. You've got 2 that need replacing. The second one is worse. But this one, he pointed to the 5th timber in the row, is starting to go. Eva felt her stomach tighten. She had missed the 5th one completely. How do I replace them? You don't replace one cap timber, Travaran said. You replace a section, 3 timbers together with new uprights on either side. That way you never have the whole roof unsupported. You're always bracing against something solid while you work. He spent the next hour teaching her the sequence. How to wedge a temporary support into place before removing the first timber. How to test each new piece before trusting it with weight. How to listen for the sound of settling, which was normal, versus the sound of cracking, which was not. When they climbed out at dusk, Eva's arms ached and her head was spinning with information. But for the first time since she had arrived on the acre, she felt like she might actually understand what she was doing. Tomorrow, Travaran said, we fix the rope. The second lesson came with the first snow. Light flurries, nothing serious, but enough to remind everyone on the bench that winter was no longer approaching. It had arrived. Travaran returned at dawn with a length of rope coiled over his shoulder and a wooden block in his hand. He set up at the well collar and showed Iva how to rig a proper windlass. Your father had a good idea with the rope, he said, threading the line through the block. But a good idea isn't the same as a good system. What happens when the rope frays? I replace it. When? Eva hesitated. When I notice it's fraying. Wrong. Travaran pulled the rope tight, testing the tension. You replace it before it frays. You check it every time you descend. You run your hand along the whole length looking for wear. You learn where the stress points are, and you reinforce them before they fail. He showed her how to build a hand-braked windlass from a salvaged wagon axle, iron shoe, and pine uprights. The design was simple but clever, a drum for the rope, a brake lever to control descent and ascent, and guide ropes on either side to keep the load from swinging. Your father lowered himself by hand, Travaran said. That works when you're young and strong and alone. But you're not going to be young forever, and you're not going to be alone forever either. A windlass means anyone can operate the shaft. It means you can lower heavy loads without killing yourself. It means that the chamber becomes something that serves the living instead of just storing the dead. He paused, and something in his expression shifted. One rule, he said, the most important rule, never trust one brake. What do you mean? I mean a single point of failure will fail. He touched the brake lever. This brake holds the load. But what happens if the lever cracks? What happens if the shoe wears through? What happens if someone lets go? Eva understood. The load falls. The load falls. And everything in it is destroyed. Travaran's eyes were hard. So you build a backup, a second brake, a locking pin, a rope catch, something that holds even when the main system fails. That's what keeps you alive underground, not strength, not luck, redundancy. They spent the rest of the day building the windlass. By evening, it stood over the shaft, rough but functional, with a main brake, a secondary rope catch, and guide rails to keep the bucket centered. Eva tested it by lowering a load of stones. The rope ran smooth. The brake held firm. The catch engaged when she released the lever. Better, Travaran said. He was breathing harder than he should have been, and his cough had worsened over the day, but there was satisfaction in his voice. Now you have a system? The third lesson came with the deepening cold. November had turned brutal. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. Ice formed on the water bucket overnight. The wind off the mountains cut through clothing and found bone. Trevarthen arrived less often now. The walk from his cabin on the lower bench was harder with his bad foot, and the cold made his lungs worse. But when he came, he taught. Your father understood something most people don't, he said one afternoon, standing in the chamber surrounded by bins and barrels. He understood that different foods need different conditions. He moved through the space, pointing as he spoke. Potatoes. They need cold and dark. Any light turns them green. Any warmth makes them sprout. They go in the darkest corner, away from the lamp, away from your body heat when you're working. He moved to the next section. Carrots and beets. They need cold and damp. Too dry and they shrivel. Too wet and they rot. You pack them in sand and sawdust. The sand holds moisture. The sawdust keeps them separated so rot doesn't spread. He moved again. Onions. They need cold and dry. Opposite of roots. You hang them where the air moves, where moisture can't settle. That corner where the exhaust vent pulls. And the meat? Meat hangs away from everything else. Trevarthen pointed to the hooks driven into the ceiling timbers. It's cured, so it doesn't need the same cold as fresh, but it can't touch anything that holds moisture. The fat goes rancid if it gets damp. The salt draws water if the air's too wet, so you hang it high, away from the bins where the air stays driest. Eva had been managing the stores by instinct, keeping things roughly where her father had placed them. Now she understood the logic behind the arrangement. Your father's rule, Trevarthen said, pointing at the penciled words on the cap timber. Never trust one temperature for every food. He learned that the hard way, probably. Lost stores to rot or freezing before he figured it out. He coughed, a long rattling sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep. The chamber is a system, temperature, humidity, airflow. Change one and you change everything. Your job is to keep all three in balance. The work continued through November. Eva replaced the 2 failing cap timbers with Trevarthen's guidance. 3 days of terrifying, exhausting labor, holding new beams in place while dust rained down and the ceiling groaned. She installed the backup brake on the Windlass, a rawhide catch that engaged automatically when the main lever released. She adjusted the intake vent angle, redirecting it to pull air from the lee side of the acre rather than the windward slope. The physical toll mounted. Her palms were calloused now, thick with scar tissue from rope and wood. Her shoulders had broadened from hauling. Though she had lost weight, her dresses hung loose, and her face had sharpened into something harder than it had been in August. But the chamber was working. She checked temperatures every 3 days, using a spirit thermometer that Trevarthen had lent her. The readings held steady. 34 degrees in the potato section, 36 near the carrots, 32 where the onions hung, cold enough to preserve, warm enough not to freeze. She checked the stores every week, potatoes firm, carrots crisp, onions dry, grain sealed, meat holding. The survival math began to shift. 3 cords of wood, carefully rationed, would last through February if she kept the stove low. The chamber held enough food for 2 winters if she ate sparingly. The windlass made access safe and fast. The vents kept the air moving. For the first time, Eva began to believe she might actually see spring. August Crawl returned in early December. He walked the acre with the same unhurried confidence, but something in his manner had changed. He spent longer looking at the shack, now tight and chinked against drafts. He examined the wood stack, now over 3 cords high. He studied the windlass over the shaft, testing the brake with his hand. "You've been busy," he said. "I've had help." "Trevarthen." Kroll nodded slowly. "I heard he'd been coming around. Man knows his underground work." "He does." Kroll walked to the well collar and looked down. The shaft was dark, but the windlass changed its character, made it look like something functional rather than something abandoned. "People are still talking," he said. "Let them. They're saying you've got food down there. More than anyone should have. They're saying your father must have been stockpiling for years." He turned to face her. "Orin's been asking questions, wants to know where the supplies came from, whether they're really yours or whether they belong to creditors." "They belong to my father. Now they belong to me." "That's what I told him." Kroll's expression was unreadable. "I also told him that a woman who can survive a winter alone on this bench is a woman worth respecting, not a woman to be cheated out of her land." Eva felt something loosen in her chest. It was not quite an apology, but it was closer than she had expected. "You said they'd haul me out stiff by New Year," she reminded him. "I remember what I said." "Do you still think that?" Kroll was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, wherein his voice had lost some of its certainty, "I think you've done more than I expected," he said. "I think you've built something that might work, but a mild start doesn't prove anything. One hard blizzard, 1 week where the cold really settles in, and we'll see what that chamber is worth." He paused. "We'll see what you're worth." He walked back down the bench road without looking back. The test approached with the speed of a held breath. December brought cold that made November feel mild. The temperature dropped to 0 and held there. Then it dropped further. 10 below. 15. The frost line crept deeper into the earth. Water froze in buckets within an hour of being drawn. Eva descended into the chamber every other day now, checking everything Trevarthen had taught her to check. The temperatures held. The stores kept. The air moved through the vents, slow but steady. Above ground, the world was dying. The landscape had turned white and gray, stripped of color and warmth. The trees stood black against the sky. The wind howled down from the mountains and found every crack, every gap, every weakness in shelter. But below ground, the chamber remained stable. 34 degrees in the potato section, 36 near the carrots, 32 where the onions hung. Her father had built below weather, and the weather was proving him right. The blizzard came on January 12th, 1888. It did not arrive with the slow build that most storms had. It came fast, hard, and without warning, a wall of wind and snow that swept down from the mountains and turned the world white in a matter of hours. Eva had been checking the wood stack when the sky changed. One moment she could see the timberline above the bench. The next moment she could see nothing but white. The wind hit her like a physical blow. She staggered, caught herself, and ran for the shack. By the time she reached the door, the snow was coming horizontal, driven so hard it stung like sand against her face. She made it inside and barred the door. The walls shook, the stovepipe rattled. Through the single window, she could see nothing but swirling white. The temperature dropped 24 degrees in 6 hours. By nightfall, the road had vanished. The first day was survivable. Eva had wood. She had a tight shack. She had food in the chamber below. She kept the stove burning low and steady, conserving fuel while maintaining enough heat to keep the water bucket from freezing solid. The wind howled through the night without pause. Snow piled against the north wall of the shack, rising higher with every hour. By morning, the drift had reached the window ledge. She cleared a path to the well collar, fighting through snow that reached her thighs. The windlass was still functioning, though ice had formed on the rope and the brake shoe. She knocked the ice free, tested the mechanism, and descended. The chamber was unchanged. 34 degrees, 36, 32. The storm that was trying to kill everything above ground had not penetrated below. She brought up potatoes, carrots, and a small portion of salt pork, enough for 2 days. She would not descend again unless she had to. The second day brought news from the bench. A boy fought his way through the drifts to her door, half frozen, sent by his mother with a message. The road to Whitewood was gone. A snowslide had come off the limestone, cut above the switchback, and buried the only wagon grade. Nothing was getting through, no freight, no mail, no help. The bench was cut off. Eva gave the boy hot water and a potato, then sent him back with instructions to stay inside. The storm was not finished. She spent the rest of the day reinforcing her preparations. She checked every seam in the shack walls. She piled extra wood inside the door. She melted snow for drinking water and stored it in crocks near the stove. The temperature outside dropped to 10 below zero. The third day brought the first real test. Eva descended into the chamber and found moisture on the walls. Not much, just a thin film of condensation beading on the stone lining near the intake vent. But it was wrong. The chamber should not be sweating. The air should be moving fast enough to carry moisture away before it could settle. She checked the intake vent and found the problem: ice. The extreme cold had frozen moisture inside the pipe, creating a partial blockage that reduced airflow. The chamber was still breathing, but barely. She spent 2 hours clearing the blockage, reaching up into darkness with a heated iron rod, melting ice, and pulling out frozen debris. By the time she finished, her arms were numb and her lungs burned from breathing the close air. But the vent was clear. The air began moving again. The moisture on the walls would evaporate. One crisis averted. She had no idea how many more were coming. The storm continued for 5 days. Each day brought new challenges. The drift against the north wall rose until it covered the window entirely. The wood stack became buried, requiring an hour of digging to access each day's fuel. The rope on the windlass froze solid twice, requiring careful heating to free it without damaging the fibers. On the fourth day, Eva heard shouting from somewhere down the bench. She fought her way toward the sound and found 3 families huddled in a single cabin, their own homes too damaged by the wind to provide shelter. They had food for perhaps a week. They had wood for less. She told them about the chamber. The first reaction was disbelief. The second was suspicion. The third, when she described what was down there and how it worked, was something close to hope. "Your father built that?" one of the men asked. "My father built it. I've been maintaining it." "And you're saying you've got food enough to share?" Eva looked at the faces around her, men, women, children, all of them cold and frightened and running out of options. She thought about the calculations she had done, the careful rationing that would see her through to spring with stores to spare. Then she thought about what it would mean to survive alone while her neighbors starved. "I'm saying we're going to get through this together," she said. "But we do it my way. We ration by mouths, not by cash. We haul by turns, not by strength, and no one goes down that shaft alone." The rationing began on the 5th day of the storm. Eva established a rotation. 2 people at the windlass, 1 person in the chamber, everyone else waiting at the collar. The loads came up in measured portions, potatoes first, then carrots, then grain for porridge, then thin slices of cured meat for broth. 42 people on the bench, 5 tons of food in the chamber. If she calculated correctly, they could last until the road opened. If she calculated wrong, they would all starve together. The physical toll was immediate. Hauling for 42 meant the windlass ran almost constantly during daylight hours. The rope wore. The brake shoe ground down. Eva's hands, already calloused, cracked and bled from the constant work. But the chamber held. Every morning she descended to check the temperatures and the stores. The readings stayed steady. The potatoes remained firm. The carrots stayed crisp in their sand beds. The onions hung dry and pungent in their corner. Her father had built below weather, and the weather above was killing everything that had not learned to dig. The contrast was stark. By the 8th day, families who had relied on shallow surface pits found their root stores frozen solid. The cold had penetrated 4 feet down, deeper than anyone had expected, deeper than most cellars were dug. Potatoes that had been fine in November were now glass hard and useless. Orin Kels had built a row of storage sheds behind his store, visible and proud, stocked with goods he had planned to sell at winter prices. The storm had buried them. The cold had penetrated them. By the 10th day, his flour had frozen, his potatoes were ruined, and his prices had become meaningless because no one had anything left to buy. He came to the shaft on the 11th day, but Eva was at the Windlass when she saw him approaching through the drifts. He moved slowly, his usual confidence stripped away by cold and humiliation. When he reached the collar, he did not speak. He simply stood and watched the bucket rise from the darkness, heavy with food that he had mocked and schemed to take. "You want a portion?" Iva said. It was not a question. Orin's jaw tightened. "I'll pay." "There's nothing to pay with. The road is closed and your money is worth less than warmth." She gestured toward the group waiting for their shares. "Get in line. Take what everyone else takes. No more, no less." For a moment she thought he would argue. His face twisted with something: pride, resentment, the bitter recognition that the woman he had tried to cheat was now the one keeping him alive. Then he walked to the back of the line and waited with everyone else. August Crawl came on the 12th day. He looked worse than Iva had ever seen him. His face was grayish beneath his beard. His fingers were bandaged, frostbite from a failed attempt to force a wagon through the drifts. One of his horses had gone lame in the effort. The other was dead. He stood at the edge of the group and watched the bucket rise. When it was his turn, he took his portion without speaking. Potatoes, carrots, a handful of grain, a sliver of salt pork. Eva caught his eye as he turned to leave. "You said they'd haul me out stiff by New Year," she said. Crawl's face did something complicated. Shame, maybe, or the uncomfortable weight of being wrong about something that mattered. "I remember what I said," he replied. "Do you still believe it?" He looked at the shaft, at the windlass, at the bucket descending for another load. Then he looked at the people waiting, his neighbors, his community, the men and women he had known for years, all of them surviving on food that came from a hole everyone had laughed at. "No," he said, "I don't." He walked away through the drifts, carrying his portion, and did not look back. The crisis deepened in the 3rd week. The road remained closed. Telegraph communication had failed. The rail line to Whitewood was buried under drifts that no crew could clear. The bench was utterly isolated, dependent entirely on what it had stored, and the cold was getting worse. The temperature dropped to 25 below zero and stayed there. Frost formed inside windows. Water froze within minutes of being set down, and men who went out to gather wood came back with gray patches on their faces that turned black within hours. Dileia Voss's youngest daughter stopped keeping broth down on the 16th day. The child was 4 years old. She had been fine when the storm started, healthy, active, one of the children who had dared each other to shout down the dry well back in October. Now she lay in her mother's arms, too weak to cry, her skin pale and her eyes glassy. There was no doctor, no medicine. Nothing but broth and warmth and desperate hope. Eva increased the child's ration. She added meat to every portion, trying to build strength. She showed Delia how to warm stones by the stove and wrap them in cloth to keep the bed warm. But she could see the fear in Delia's eyes. While the same woman who had called the chamber a pantry and a grave was now watching her daughter slip toward a real one. The mechanical failure came on the 18th day. Iva was at the windlass, lowering the bucket for the morning haul, when the brake shoe slipped. It happened fast. One moment the load was descending smoothly. The next moment the brake lever jerked in her hand, and the rope began racing through her grip, burning her palms, the bucket falling free toward the bottom of the shaft. She grabbed for the backup catch, the rawhide brake that Travaran had taught her to install. Her fingers found it, pulled it, felt it engage. The rope snapped taut. The windlass groaned. The bucket stopped, swinging in darkness, maybe 8 feet from the chamber floor. Eva stood at the collar, heart pounding, palms bleeding, Nina staring down into the shaft at the disaster that had almost happened. If the backup had failed, if the rope had snapped, if the bucket had hit the floor and shattered, she would have lost the haul. She might have damaged the stores. She would have had to descend on a fraying rope with no way to know if it would hold. The system had worked. The redundancy had saved her. But the main brake shoe was shot, worn through from weeks of constant use, and she had no way to replace it. Milo Redfern arrived that afternoon. He was 36 years old, a widowed wheelwright who had been traveling from Rapid City when the storm cut the road. He had spent the past 2 weeks sheltering in an abandoned line shack 4 miles down the bench, surviving on jerky and melted snow. When the worst of the wind died, he walked to Cedar Draw looking for food and warmth. He found Iva standing at the windlass, staring at a broken brake shoe. "That's your problem right there," he said, pointing at the worn iron. "The shoe's ground down to nothing. You've been running this too hard." Iva looked up. The stranger was lean, weathered, with hands that spoke of metalwork, calloused in the places that hammers and files created calluses. "I know what the problem is," she said. "I don't know how to fix it." Redfern studied the windlass for a long moment. Then he crouched beside it and examined the brake mechanism, running his fingers over the worn surfaces. "I can fix it," he said. "I'm a wheelwright. Iron is what I do." He paused. "But I'll need a forge, or at least a good fire and something to use as an anvil. I have a stove and a flat rock." "That might work." He stood, wincing slightly. The cold had gotten into his joints during his 2 weeks of isolation. "You're the one with the underground food, aren't you? The Penrose woman." "I'm the one." "Then we have a deal. I fix your brake. You give me a portion." Eva studied his face. There was no guile in it, no calculation like Orin's, just a practical man offering a practical trade. "Done," she said. Redfern worked through the afternoon and into the evening. He used Iva's stove to heat a piece of scrap iron until it glowed. He shaped it on the flat rock, hammering and folding, creating a new brake shoe that would fit the windlass drum. But the work was rough but solid, the kind of craftsmanship that came from years of practical experience. But he did not stop with the brake shoe. "Your backup catch is good," he said, examining the rawhide mechanism that Travaran had designed. "But it's not good enough. If this fails, you've got nothing. That's why we have 2 brakes. You need 3. He was already reaching for more scrap iron. "A mechanical catch that engages when the drum spins too fast. Automatic. You don't have to think about it, don't have to grab for it. It just works." By midnight, he had built the 3rd brake, a ratcheted catch that clicked into place whenever the rope moved faster than a controlled descent. Eva tested it by releasing the main brake suddenly. The catch engaged with a solid clunk, stopping the drum dead. "Never trust one brake," she said. Redfern looked at her. Someone taught you that? Someone taught me that. The crisis continued through January and into February. The road remained closed, the drifts remained high, but the chamber remained stable and the portions remained steady, and the people on the bench remained alive. Delia's daughter recovered slowly. The extra meat made a difference. The warmth made a difference. Or maybe she was simply stronger than she looked. By the end of January, she was keeping broth down. By February, she was asking for more. Delia came to the shaft one afternoon while Iva was checking the stores. She stood at the collar and watched the bucket rise, and when Iva climbed out, she spoke. I called it a pantry and a grave. I remember. I was wrong. Delia's voice was rough. I was wrong about all of it. About the chamber. About your father. About you. Eva did not know what to say. She had spent months defending her father's work, explaining his logic, proving his methods. She had expected vindication to feel like victory. It did not. It felt like exhaustion. He built something that works, Iva said. I just learned how to use it. You kept us alive. Delia's eyes were wet. My daughter is alive because of what you kept in that hole. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't have to thank me. You just have to learn. Eva gestured toward the shaft. Next winter, you build your own, below the frost line. Proper ventilation, proper storage. And then the next storm won't matter. Delia nodded slowly. It was not quite understanding, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. The road opened on April 4th, 107 days after the blizzard struck. A crew from Whitewood finally cleared the snow slide from the switchback and pushed through to the bench. They found 42 people alive. They found stores depleted but not exhausted. They found a community that had survived a winter that should have killed them. They found Iva Penrose standing at a well collar, watching the first wagons come up the road. August Crawl was among the first to reach her. He looked better than he had in January. The frostbite had healed, though 2 fingers were gone from his left hand. He stopped at the edge of the acre and looked at the windlass, at the shaft, at the woman who had kept his neighbors fed. I told you they'd haul you out stiff by New Year, he said. I remember. I was wrong. He paused. I was wrong about your father, too. Oh, he wasn't mad. He was the only one on this bench who understood what a hard winter really meant. Eva looked at the shaft. The rope hung slack now. The bucket rested on the collar stones. Below, in darkness, the chamber waited, emptier than it had been in August, but still there, still functional, still ready for the next test. He understood one thing, she said. He understood that weather always comes back, and the people who prepare for it are the people who survive it. She turned and walked toward the shack, leaving August Crawl standing at the mouth of the dry well that had never made water, but had made something far more valuable. It had made time. The first wagons brought flour, salt, and news. The news was worse than the supplies were good. The blizzard of January 12th had killed hundreds across the northern plains. Your children had frozen walking home from school. Cattle had died by the thousands. Entire communities had been cut off for weeks. The newspapers were calling it the worst storm in a generation. But on Cedar Draw, 42 people had survived, and the reason was already becoming a story. The validation began before Iva was ready for it. August Crawl came to the acre 3 days after the road opened. He did not come alone. He brought 2 men from Whitewood, a freight agent and a land assessor who had heard about the underground storage and wanted to see it for themselves. Iva met them at the well collar. This is the shaft? The freight agent asked, peering down into darkness. This is the shaft. And the storage chamber is at the bottom? 28 feet down. Through a door in the wall. The assessor was making notes in a small book. How large is the chamber? 14 by 16 feet, 7-foot ceiling, stone and timber construction. And you're saying it held food for 42 people through a 4-month closure? 107 days. Eva looked at Kral. August can confirm. Kral nodded slowly. His face held none of the skepticism it had carried in August. The 2 missing fingers on his left hand were reminder enough of what the winter had cost him. She kept us alive, he said. Every person on this bench ate from that chamber. Without it, we'd have starved before February. The freight agent and the assessor exchanged glances. They had come expecting to find exaggeration, the kind of frontier tall tale that grew with each telling. What they found was a woman standing beside a hole in the ground, surrounded by neighbors who owed her their lives. We'd like to see the chamber, the freight agent said. Eva considered the request. She had spent months guarding the shaft from curiosity and theft. Now she was being asked to open it to strangers. But the strangers were not Orin Kels. They were not looking for ways to take what she had built. They were looking to understand it. One at a time, she said, and you follow my rules. She took them down separately, teaching as she went. The freight agent went first. He was a large man, uncomfortable on the rope, and his eyes went wide when he stepped through the iron-banded door into the chamber beyond. Eva watched him take in the bins, the barrels, the hanging meat, the penciled notes on the cap timber. Your father built this, he said. My father built it. I learned to run it. How? He turned to face her. How does someone learn to run something like this? Someone teaches them. Eva touched one of the cap timbers, a new one, fitted in November with Travaran's guidance. A man named Marin Travaran spent 2 months showing me how underground storage works, ventilation, temperature separation, load distribution. He was a mine timberman before his lungs gave out. And the food just keeps? The food keeps because the conditions are right. She walked him through the chamber, explaining as she went, potatoes in darkness, carrots in damp sand, onions in dry air, meat hung high, grain sealed tight. Change any one condition and the system fails. You keep them all in balance and the food lasts as long as you need it to. The freight agent was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. I've been hauling goods through these mountains for 12 years, he said. I've seen 100 ways to store food, and I've never seen anything like this. You've never seen anyone dig below the frost line? No. He looked at her with something that might have been respect. I haven't. The assessor's reaction was different. He descended with a measuring tape and a surveyor's eye, recording dimensions and angles with professional precision. When he emerged, he sat at the well collar and made calculations in his notebook. The depth is critical, he said, more to himself than to Iva. Below 4 feet, the temperature stabilizes. Below 6, it barely fluctuates. At 28 feet, he trailed off, writing numbers. At 28 feet, the earth holds steady year-round, Eva finished. 32 to 36 degrees, depending on the section. Cold enough to preserve, warm enough not to freeze. The assessor looked up. You've been tracking the temperatures? Since September, I have records. She showed him the small notebook where she had logged every reading, every check, every adjustment. The assessor studied the pages with growing interest. This is systematic, he said. This is scientific. This is survival. Eva took the notebook back. My father figured out the principles. The Cornishman taught me the mechanics. I'm just the one who kept it running. You're the one who fed 42 people through the worst winter in a decade. The assessor closed his own notebook. That's worth more than principles. Dileia Voss came to the acre on the 5th day after the road opened. She came alone, without her daughter, carrying a bundle of clean sacks and a jar of lard. She set them on the well collar and stood looking at the shaft for a long time before she spoke. I want to learn, she said. Eva studied her face. The woman who had called the chamber a grave was thinner than she had been in October. The winter had cost her weight, sleep, and certainty, but her eyes were clear. Learn what? How to build one. Dileia gestured at the shaft. Not this big. I don't have the labor or the land, but something. A family cellar, deep enough that the frost can't reach it. Why? The question was not a challenge. Eva genuinely wanted to know what had changed. Dileia was silent for a moment. When she spoke, where her voice was rough. My daughter almost died, she said. Not from the cold, not from the storm, from hunger. We had stores and they froze, and we had nothing left to feed her. She paused. Your chamber saved her. But I can't depend on your chamber forever. I need to learn to save her myself. Eva nodded slowly. It was the answer she had hoped for. Come back tomorrow, she said. Bring a shovel and someone to help dig. I'll show you where to start. The teaching began in earnest. Over the following weeks, Iva showed Dileia how to site a cellar, reading the slope of the land, checking for drainage, testing soil depth with a rod. She showed her how to calculate frost depth for the bench, adding 2 feet of margin for safety. She showed her how to shore walls with timber, leaving space for air movement. Dileia was not a natural student. She questioned everything, challenged assumptions, demanded explanations for choices that Iva had learned by instinct. But she was determined, and determination counted for more than talent. Why can't I dig where the ground is flattest? Dileia asked one afternoon. Because flat ground collects water. Your cellar will flood in the first spring thaw. Then where? Slight slope, just enough that water runs away from the entrance, not toward it. Eva pointed to a section of Dileia's land. There, the grade falls about 2 inches over 10 feet. That's enough. Dileia studied the spot with narrowed eyes. How do you know? Because Travaran showed me the same thing on my father's acre. The spoil terraces my father built weren't random. Nah, they were drainage channels. Your father thought of everything. My father thought of the wrong things for 20 years before he figured out the right ones. Iva handed Dileia a marking stake. The difference is, he kept learning. So should you. Others followed. A farmer named Halverson came asking about potato storage. His family had lost 300 pounds to frost damage, and he wanted to understand why. Eva explained the chemistry of freezing, the way ice crystals burst cell walls and turned firm potatoes to mush. She showed him how depth protected against temperature swings. A widow named Birgit came asking about grain storage. Her flour barrel had taken moisture during the thaw and turned to paste. Eva explained the importance of sealed containers, of keeping grain away from areas where condensation formed, ease of checking for signs of dampness before it became rot. A young couple building their first homestead came asking about everything. They had arrived on the bench after the blizzard and heard stories about the woman who had kept 42 people alive. Iva spent an entire day walking their land with them, explaining where to dig, how deep to go, what mistakes to avoid. She did not charge for the knowledge. She gave it freely, the way Travaran had given it to her. But the giving was not without cost. Each hour spent teaching was an hour not spent maintaining her own operation. Each visitor was a demand on time and attention that she could not spare. By May, she was exhausted, thinner than she had been in winter, sleeping poorly, eating irregularly. The chamber had kept her alive. Now the knowledge of the chamber was slowly wearing her down. Orin Kels reappeared in late May. He had spent the months since the blizzard quietly, tending his store, selling goods at prices that no longer seemed quite so steep. The winter had humbled him, but it had not changed him. Eva was teaching Delia's son how to check timber soundness when Orin walked up the bench road. He stopped at the edge of the acre and watched them work, his expression unreadable. "You're giving it away," he said. Eva did not look up. "Giving what away?" "The knowledge, the method, the thing that made you valuable." He stepped closer. "In 2 years, every family on this bench will have their own cellar. They won't need you anymore. They won't come to your shaft. They won't trade for your stores. Why, you'll have given away the only advantage you had." "That's the plan." Orin's face twisted. "That's foolish." "Is it?" Now Iva did look up. "I spent 4 months feeding 42 people because no one else had thought to dig below the frost line. If everyone on this bench had proper storage, I wouldn't have needed to ration for 42. I could have rationed for 1. And what would the rest of them have done? Survived on their own, the way they should have." She stood and faced him directly. "My father didn't build that chamber to make money. He built it to survive. I'm not interested in turning survival into a commodity." Orin stared at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, resentment, calculation, the bitter recognition that her generosity was making his business model obsolete. Your father built it," he said finally. "You just opened a door." He turned and walked back down the bench road. Delia's son watched him go. "Is he going to cause trouble?" "He already has." Eva picked up her hammer. "Let's get back to work." Marin Travaran returned in early June. He had spent the worst of the winter in his cabin on the lower bench, too sick to make the walk to Cedar Draw, too proud to ask for help. A neighbor had brought him food from the communal halls, potatoes and carrots, and broth made from Iva's stores. He arrived at the acre coughing worse than ever, his face grayish, his weight down by 20 pounds, but his eyes were still sharp and his hands still steady. "I heard you kept them all alive," he said. "The chamber kept them alive." "You taught me how to run the chamber." "I taught you mechanics." Travaran lowered himself onto a stump near the well collar, breathing heavily. "You learned judgment on your own." They sat together in the afternoon sun, the woman and the old miner, watching the bench come back to life around them. The snow was gone. The grass was greening. Birds had returned to the timberline. "I need to build something else," Eva said. Travaran raised an eyebrow. "Your chamber isn't enough?" "My chamber is a reserve. One system, one family, one point of failure." She gestured toward the settlement below. "Every family on this bench needs their own storage. Smaller than mine, but built the same way. Below the frost line, proper ventilation, climate separation. That's a lot of digging. That's a lot of teaching." Eva turned to face him. "No, I've been showing people where to site their cellars, how to calculate depth, but I don't know enough about the construction. I don't know how to shore different soil types, or how to handle water intrusion, or how to build proper doors." Travaran was silent for a moment. Then he laughed, a wet, rattling sound that turned into a cough. "You want me to teach you more," he said when he could speak again. "I want us to build something together, a model cellar, something people can see and copy." "I'm dying, Eva." The words hung in the air. Eva had known. She had seen it in his face, heard it in his breathing, but hearing him say it made it real. "I know," she said. "The rock dust." Travaran touched his chest. "It's been eating my lungs for 30 years. I've got maybe 6 months, maybe less." "Then we should start now." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, resignation giving way to something warmer. "You're stubborn," he said. "I learned from stubborn men." They worked through June and into July. The project was a demonstration cellar, smaller than Iva's chamber, designed for a single family, built on a slope above Delia's land where the soil was good and the drainage was natural. Travaran directed while Iva dug, his instructions precise even when his breath failed. "Stop there." He pointed with his hammer at the wall of the excavation. "You're hitting clay. That's good. Clay holds shape better than sand, but you need to leave room for the timber." Eva marked the line and kept digging. "The doorframe goes against the clay," Travaran continued. "Wood warps. Clay doesn't. Let the earth do the holding." They built the shoring together, or rather, Iva built while Travaran supervised, his hands too weak for heavy work, but his knowledge still sharp. He showed her how to fit timbers in different soil types, how to use wedges to tighten joints, how to listen for the sounds of settling versus the sounds of failure. One afternoon, he told her about Cornwall. "I went underground when I was 12, he said. They were sitting at the edge of the excavation, resting between loads of timber. "My father was a miner, his father was a miner. We worked the tin loads until the tin ran out, and then we came here to work the gold." "Did you find any?" "Some. Not enough to matter." He coughed, wiped his mouth. "What I found was rock dust. What I found was a crushed foot and a set of lungs that stopped working properly. What I found was 23 years of underground experience that no one wanted once I couldn't swing a pick anymore. Until now." "Until now." He looked at her. "You're the first person in 10 years who wanted to know what I knew. The first person who saw that knowledge of underground spaces could be worth something besides death." Eva did not know what to say. She thought of her father, spending 10 years in a hole that everyone called madness. She thought of herself, learning to run a chamber that everyone had dismissed as a grave. "Knowledge is only worth something if it gets passed on," she said finally. "Otherwise it dies with us." Travaran nodded slowly. "That's why I came back. That's why I'm helping you build this." They disagreed only once. It happened in late July when the cellar was nearly complete. Eva wanted to add a second vent, redundancy, the principle Travaran himself had taught her. Travaran argued against it. "Two vents means 2 points of failure," he said. "2 places where roots can grow in. 2 openings that need to be checked and cleared." "2 vents also means backup," Eva countered. "If one clogs, the other keeps the air moving." "In theory. In practice, people get lazy. They check the primary vent and ignore the secondary. The secondary clogs, they don't notice, and when the primary fails, they think the whole system is dead. So you teach them to check both." "You can't teach everyone everything." Travaran's voice was harder now. "Some lessons people learn. In some lessons they ignore. A system that requires perfect maintenance will fail the first time someone skips a step." They stood on opposite sides of the half-finished cellar, looking at each other across the packed earth. "You taught me to never trust one break," Iva said. "I taught you to build redundancy into critical systems. A windlass is a critical system. A vent is not. The vent is what keeps the food from spoiling. The vent is what keeps the air from going bad. How is that not critical?" Travaran opened his mouth to argue, then he stopped. A strange expression crossed his face, something that might have been pride. "You're right," he said. Eva blinked. "What?" "You're right." He walked around the cellar to stand beside her. "I've been building for miners, men who check their equipment because their lives depend on it. But you're building for farmers, people who have 100 things to worry about besides one hole in the ground." So we add the second vent. We add the second vent. And we build it so that checking one means checking both. Same opening, two channels. One action, two results. They finished the design together. Travaran died in the first week of September. Eva found him in his cabin on the lower bench, sitting in his chair by the cold stove, his eyes closed and his breathing stopped. He looked peaceful, more peaceful than he had seemed in months. The rock dust had finally finished what it started 30 years ago. She buried him beside the demonstration cellar they had built together. It seemed fitting. His knowledge would stay close to the thing it had created. The funeral was small, a few miners from the early days, now August Krall, who had known Travaran by reputation, Milo Redfern, who had met him only once but understood what losing a teacher meant. Eva spoke briefly. He spent 23 years learning how to keep people alive underground, she said. He spent the last 2 months teaching me what he knew. I will not let that knowledge die. She placed his sounding hammer on the grave, the tool he had given her when his hands grew too weak to use it. The iron was worn smooth from decades of work. The handle was dark with the oil of his palms. She did not cry. There would be time for grief later. For now, there was work to do. The secondary crisis came 3 weeks after Travaran's death. A cloudburst rolled off the ridge in late September, the kind of sudden, violent rain that dropped inches of water in hours and then vanished as quickly as it had arrived. The bench had seen storms like this before, but this time the consequences were different. Orin Kels had built a row of storage pits behind his store over the summer, shallow excavations, poorly drained, designed to hold the overflow from families who did not want to dig their own cellars. He had charged for access, turning storage into another source of income. The cloudburst flooded every one of them. Eva heard the shouting from her acre. She grabbed a lantern and ran down the bench, following the sound to Orin's store. A crowd had gathered, farmers, families, people who had paid good money to store their fall harvest in Orin's pits. The pits were full of water. Potatoes floated like pale corpses. Grain barrels had tipped and split. Carrots bobbed in murky soup. It's ruined, someone was saying. All of it. The whole harvest. Eva pushed through the crowd. Orin was standing at the edge of his pits, his face white, his hands opening and closing at his sides. The drainage was supposed to hold, he said. His voice sounded strange, thin, and defensive. I dug the channels myself. You dug the channels 3 inches deep, Eva said, in flat ground with no fall line. Orin turned to face her. You think you could have done better? I know I could have done better. She looked at the ruined stores, the floating produce, the faces of the families who had trusted Orin's shortcuts. But that's not the question. The question is what we do now. The answer was the Penrose Vault. Eva opened it for the first time since the road had cleared, not for her own stores, but as an emergency reserve. The chamber still held surplus from the previous winter, potatoes that had kept through summer, grain that remained dry, cured meat that hung untouched. But the vault alone was not enough. The cloudburst had damaged family cellars across the bench, even well-built ones, if they had been sited poorly or maintained carelessly. The flooding was not just Orin's problem, it was everyone's problem. We need to sort everything, Eva said. She was standing in the demonstration cellar she had built with Travaran, surrounded by a crowd of anxious farmers. The cellar had survived the cloudburst, its drainage worked, its vents were clear, its stores remained dry. It was proof that proper construction mattered. Sort what? Someone asked. The damaged stores. Not everything is ruined. Some potatoes are fine if they're dried and repacked. Some grain is salvageable if it's spread in the sun. Some carrots can be trimmed and eaten now, instead of stored. She pointed to the open door of the cellar. We use this as a staging area. Anything that can be saved goes to dry ground. Anything that's ruined goes to compost. And anything that's in good condition goes into the reserve chamber. Your chamber. The community's chamber. Eva met the speaker's eyes. It was one of the farmers who had lost stores in Orin's pits. That's what my father built it for. That's what I've been maintaining it for. One large reserve that serves everyone, backed by family cellars that serve each household. The work began that afternoon. For 3 days, Eva directed the salvage operation. She applied every lesson Travaran had taught her, and some he had not. She showed farmers how to check produce for the soft spots that signaled rot, how to dry damp grain without cooking it, how to rescue waterlogged root vegetables by spreading them on warm rocks and turning them every hour. She did not descend into the vault to supervise. She trusted the volunteers to follow the rules she had established. One person in the chamber at a time, careful inventory of everything added, strict separation of wet stores from dry. Marin would have been proud. By the end of the 3rd day, they had salvaged roughly half of what had been lost. The other half was gone, composted or fed to livestock, or simply abandoned as too damaged to save. It was not a complete recovery, but it was better than the total loss that had seemed inevitable when the pits first flooded. Orin Kels stood at the edge of the operation, watching his neighbors work. He had not offered to help. He had not apologized for the failures of his construction. He simply watched, his face unreadable, as Eva directed the salvage of stores he had promised to protect. On the 3rd evening, he approached her. "You humiliated me," he said. Eva was checking a barrel of grain for moisture. She did not look up. "You humiliated yourself. I built those pits the way anyone would have built them. I dug the channels. I set the drains. I did the work. You did the work wrong." Now she did look up. "You dug shallow because shallow was easy. You skipped the drainage survey because it took time. You charged people for storage you couldn't guarantee because you saw an opportunity and you took it." "I saw an opportunity." Orin's voice was bitter. "That's what I do. That's what anyone with sense does. My father saw an opportunity too. He saw that winters kill people, and he spent 10 years building something that would keep him alive." Iva stood and faced him. "The difference is, he didn't charge for it. And when the time came, the thing he built actually worked." Orin stared at her. Something was happening behind his eyes. Calculation, resentment, and underneath it all, the uncomfortable weight of being publicly, undeniably wrong. "Your father built it," he said finally. "You just opened a door." "I've heard that before." Iva turned back to the grain barrel. "It was wrong then. It's still wrong now." She heard him walk away, hear his footsteps fading down the bench road. She did not watch him go. The community emerged from the crisis changed. The families who had trusted Orin's pits learned their lesson. Over the following weeks, they came to Iva one by one, asking for help building proper cellars. She showed them the demonstration cellar she had built with Travaran. She walked their land with them, testing soil, checking drainage, marking sites. By October, 6 new cellars were under construction on the bench. By November, 4 were complete. By the first snow, every family that had lost stores in Orin's flood had replaced them with proper underground storage. The Penrose method was spreading. Eva did not call it that. She called it common sense, the kind of common sense that required a generation of stubborn preparation and a winter that nearly killed everyone before it took root. But the name stuck anyway. People on the bench talked about Penrose cellars and Penrose storage and the Penrose way of doing things. Her father's madness had become local wisdom. August Crawl came to the acre in early November, the anniversary of the first hard frost. He found Iva at the windlass, checking the rope the way Travaran had taught her, running her hand along the full length, feeling for wear, testing the brake mechanisms one by one. "I owe you an apology," he said. Eva looked up. Crawl was standing at the edge of the acre, his remaining fingers tucked into his coat against the cold. His face was different than it had been a year ago, softer somehow, as if the weight of being wrong had ground down the sharp edges of his certainty. For what? For what I said when you first arrived. For telling you they'd haul you out stiff by New Year. For treating your father's work like a madman's joke. Eva was silent for a moment. She thought about the summer she had spent, the winter she had survived, the spring and summer that had followed. She thought about Marin Travaran dying in his chair, with rock dust in his lungs and knowledge in his hands. She thought about her father, alone in this hole for 10 years, building something no one understood. "You weren't wrong to doubt," she said finally. "You were wrong about what you doubted." "I don't understand. You saw a woman with $46 and no experience, and you thought she would fail. That was reasonable. What wasn't reasonable was assuming that she had nothing to learn from." Eva touched the windlass drum, the iron brake shoe that Milo Redfern had shaped, the rawhide catch that Travaran had designed, the rope that she had learned to check every single time she descended. "My father left me more than a dry well. He left me a method, and the method was worth more than anyone on this bench could see." Crawl nodded slowly. "I see it now." "I know you do." Eva smiled, a small, tired expression that did not quite reach her eyes. "That's why you're here." "I want to learn." He looked down the shaft, then back at her. "My fingers are gone. I can't haul freight the way I used to, but I can dig. I can shore timber. I can build something that will keep my family alive when the next bad winter comes." Eva studied his face. But the man who had predicted her death was asking for her help. The man who had dismissed her father's work was ready to learn it. She thought about what Travaran had said, about knowledge dying with the people who held it. She thought about the demonstration cellar on the slope above Deleia's land, the cellars spreading across the bench, the method taking root in soil that had once seemed barren. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "Bring a shovel. I'll show you where to start." The hostile skeptic's arc reached its crisis point in December. Orin Kels had spent the autumn quietly, running his store, selling goods, saying nothing about the flood that had destroyed his reputation. But he had not accepted his failure. He had been planning. Eva learned about it from Dileia, who had heard it from a neighbor, or who had heard it from someone who worked in Orin's store. The storekeeper was claiming that the Penrose method was dangerous. He was telling people that underground storage caused illness, that the air in cellars was poisonous, that the food preserved there was contaminated. "He's scared," Dileia said. "Scared that no one will need his storage anymore. Scared that you've made him irrelevant." "He made himself irrelevant when his pits flooded." "That's not how he sees it." Delia's face was worried. "He's talking to the land assessor from Whitewood. He's asking about regulations, permits, ways to make underground storage illegal unless it's inspected and approved." Iva felt her jaw tighten. "And who would do the inspecting?" "He would, probably, or someone he pays." It was exactly the kind of scheme Orin would devise, turning his failure into leverage, using bureaucracy to control what he could not compete with. If he succeeded, every seller on the bench would need his approval. Every family would owe him fees. The method that had saved the community would become another tool for extraction. "I need to talk to him," Eva said. "Talk won't change his mind." then I need to change something else. The confrontation happened at Orin's store. Eva walked down the bench road on a cold December morning, past the families who waved from their homesteads, past the cellars under construction, past the demonstration cellar where Travaran was buried. She walked until she reached Orin's store, through with its false front and its loaded shelves and its owner standing behind the counter with his ledger open. Miss Penrose. Orin's smile did not reach his eyes. Come to buy something? Come to settle something. Eva walked to the counter and placed her hands flat on the wood. I've heard what you've been telling people about the storage being dangerous, about the air being bad, about the need for inspections. Public safety is everyone's concern. Public safety is what I've been working on for 6 months. Proper drainage, proper ventilation, proper construction, the kind of building that doesn't flood when it rains. Orin's expression flickered. I made a mistake with those pits. I'll admit that. But that doesn't mean... It means you don't know what you're talking about. Eva kept her voice level, but her eyes were hard. But you built shallow because you didn't understand depth. You skipped drainage because you didn't understand water flow. You charged people money for storage that failed because you saw opportunity where you should have seen responsibility. And you know better? I learned better. From a man who spent 23 years underground. From a father who spent 10 years digging below the frost line. From a winter that proved the method works. Orin leaned forward. Your father dug it. You just opened a door. You've said that before. Eva did not flinch. Here's what you haven't said. You know it worked. You ate from that chamber the same as everyone else. You took your portion when the road was closed. You survived because of something you called madness. The store was silent. Other customers had stopped to listen. Farmers, families. You people who remembered the winter and the rationing and the woman at the shaft collar. So here's what's going to happen, Eva continued. You can keep spreading lies about underground storage, and I can invite every person on this bench to inspect my chamber, my cellars, my methods. They can see for themselves whether the air is bad. They can judge for themselves whether the food is safe. And they can decide for themselves who to trust, the woman who kept them alive or the man who let their harvest rot. Orin's face had gone pale. He looked around the store at the watching faces, and what he saw there must have told him everything he needed to know. Or, Eva said, you can stop. You can accept that your pits failed and my methods didn't. You can learn to build properly, the way August Kroll is learning, the way Dileia Voss is learning, the way every family on this bench is learning. You can become part of what's working instead of trying to tear it down. She stepped back from the counter. Your choice. Orin was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Your father built it. You made it useful. It was not quite an apology. It was not quite a surrender, but it was close enough. Eva nodded once and walked out of the store. The winter of 1888–89 was milder than its predecessor. The storms came, but they did not stay. The cold bit, but it did not kill. The road closed twice, but only for weeks, not months. It was the kind of winter that let people forget what the bad ones could do. Eva did not forget. She spent the winter teaching. Through every family that had started a cellar in the autumn needed guidance to finish it. Every cellar that was finished needed instruction on how to stock it properly. Every person who had survived the previous January needed to understand why they had survived, and how to do it again without depending on a single woman and a single shaft. The work was exhausting, but it was also necessary. By spring, the bench had changed. 6 family cellars were complete and stocked. 4 more were under construction. The demonstration cellar that Eva had built with Travaran had become a teaching site, a place where new families came to see how proper underground storage worked before they started digging their own. August Kroll finished his cellar in March. It was smaller than Iva's chamber, but built to the same principles. Below the frost line, properly ventilated, with drainage that ran away from the entrance and storage sections separated by climate needs. He stocked it with potatoes, carrots, and grain from the previous harvest. "How do I know if it's working?" he asked. Eva showed him how to check temperatures with a spirit thermometer. She showed him how to feel the air movement with a candle flame. She showed him how to tap timbers and listen for the hollow sound that meant trouble. "You check it every week," she said. "Even when everything seems fine, especially when everything seems fine." "Every week." "Every week." She handed him the thermometer. "The chamber doesn't fail all at once. It fails in small ways first, a clogged vent, a damp corner, a timber that's starting to crack. If you catch the small failures, you never face the big ones." Kroll nodded slowly. The man who had once dismissed her father's work was now holding the tools that made that work possible. "I'll check it every week," he said. Delia's cellar was finished in April. It was the first one built entirely by someone Iva had taught, dug by Delia and her son, shored by techniques learned from observation, stocked according to principles that Delia had once mocked as foolishness. Eva inspected it on a warm afternoon, descending into the earth with her lamp and her hammer and the critical eye that Travaran had trained. The walls were solid. The ventilation was working. The storage sections were properly separated. "You built this well," Eva said. Delia stood at the collar, looking down at the woman who had saved her daughter's life. Her face held something complicated: pride, gratitude, and the lingering memory of everything she had gotten wrong. "I built it the way you showed me," she said. "You built it the way the land allowed. I showed you principles. You applied them." Eva climbed out and stood beside her. "That's the difference between knowledge and skill. Knowledge I can give you. Skill you had to earn." Delia was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that Iva had been expecting since the winter. "Why did you help me?" "What do you mean?" "I called your father mad. I called your chamber a grave. I told you the whole plan was foolish." Delia's voice was rough. "And then you saved my daughter. And then you taught me everything you knew. Why?" Eva looked at the cellar, at the shaft opening, at the land that Delia had transformed from vulnerability into security. Because my father helped no one," she said. "He built something that could have saved the entire bench, and he told no one about it. He kept his knowledge in his head and his stores in his hole, and when he died, everything he knew almost died with him." She paused. "I'm not going to make the same mistake." Delia nodded slowly. It was not quite understanding, but it was the beginning of it. The Penrose method spread beyond Cedar Draw. Word traveled down the bench road to Whitewood, then along the rail line to other settlements. Families who had heard about the winter of 1888, about the 42 people who had survived on stores from a single chamber, came to see for themselves. Eva showed them the original vault, descending with them into darkness, but explaining the principles that her father had discovered and she had learned to apply. She showed them the demonstration cellar, pointing out the drainage channels, the vent design, the timber shoring that Travaran had taught her to build. She walked their land with them, testing soil, checking slopes, marking sites for excavation. She did not charge. She never charged. "You're building something more valuable than money," she told a farmer from the next valley who had offered to pay for her guidance. "You're building knowledge that will outlive both of us. That's worth more than anything you could put in my hand." The farmer looked skeptical, but he took her advice anyway. Milo Redfern had stayed on the bench after the blizzard. He had found work as a wheelwright, repairing wagons and building hardware for the families who were constructing cellars. His ironwork was solid. The brake shoe he had shaped during the crisis was still functioning on Eva's Windlass, and his manner was quiet without being cold. Eva saw him often. He worked on homesteads across the bench, and his path crossed hers whenever there was ironwork to be done. A new hinge for a cellar door, a better bracket for a windlass frame, a set of iron rings for rope guides. They did not talk much at first. Redfern was not a talker, and Iva was too busy teaching to spend time on conversation. But the work brought them together, and the work created its own kind of understanding. "You're building these doors too thin," he said one afternoon. Eva looked up from the plank she was fitting to a new cellar entrance. What do you mean?" "I mean a single layer of pine won't hold against a hard winter. The cold comes through. The wood warps. By spring you've got gaps." "What do you suggest?" Redfern walked to the door and examined it with a wheelwright's eye. "Double layer. Pine outside, something denser inside. Iron strapping to hold them together." He traced a line along the edge. "The strap goes here, here, and here, prevents warping, keeps the seal tight." Eva studied his suggestion. It was practical. It was specific. It came from someone who understood materials in a way that she did not. "Show me," she said. He did. Over the following weeks, Redfern taught her about ironwork, the way Travaran had taught her about timber, how different metals expanded and contracted with temperature, how to fit hardware so that it would hold through years of use, how to think about stress points and failure modes, and the slow degradation that came from weather and wear. In return, Eva taught him about underground storage, the principles her father had discovered, the mechanics Travaran had explained, the methods she had developed through trial and necessity. They learned from each other, and in the learning, something else began to grow. The courtship was not romantic in the usual sense. There were no declarations, no formal calls, no carefully worded letters. There was simply work, shared work, complementary work, the kind of labor that required two people who understood what they were building. Redfern repaired the windlass in May of 1889. The original drum had worn down after 2 years of constant use. And the replacement he built was better, smoother, stronger, with brake mechanisms that required less maintenance. Eva helped him build a workshop in June, a small structure near his cabin with a forge and an anvil and storage for the iron stock he used in his trade. They worked side by side through the summer. They ate together when the day's labor was done. They talked about cellars and ironwork and the families they were helping to prepare for winters that had not yet come. One evening in August, Redfern asked her to marry him. He did not make a speech. He did not get down on one knee. He simply looked at her across the workbench where they had been fitting hardware to a cellar door and said, "I think we should build something together. Something more than cellars." Eva looked at him, at his weathered face, his capable hands, Brian his quiet eyes that held none of the calculation she had learned to watch for in men. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. "A life." He paused. "A family. Something that lasts." She thought about it for a long moment. She thought about her father, who had built alone and died alone. She thought about Travaran, who had passed on everything he knew because he understood that knowledge died with the people who held it. She thought about the bench, the cellars, the community that had learned to survive because someone had been willing to teach them. "Yes," she said. They married in October of 1889. The wedding was small, a minister from Whitewood, a handful of neighbors, a meal served in Iva's shack with food drawn from the chamber below. August Krall stood as a witness. Dileia Voss brought bread she had baked herself. Even Orin Kels came, standing at the back of the gathering with an expression that was not quite grudging, but was not quite warm either. Eva wore her mother's dress, altered to fit. Milo wore a clean shirt that Delia had mended. They exchanged vows in the afternoon light, and when it was done, they walked together to the well collar and looked down into darkness. "Your father built this," Milo said. "My father built this." Eva touched the windlass drum, the one Milo had built to replace the original. "You improved it, and now we'll maintain it together." Together. They stood at the edge of the shaft for a long moment, looking at the thing that had changed everything. Then they went inside to join their guests, and the celebration continued into the evening. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Eva and Milo built a proper house on the acre in 1890, larger than the shack, with a root cellar of its own, and a workshop attached for Milo's ironwork. They raised their first child, a daughter named Sigrid, after Eva's mother in 1891. A son, Martin, followed in 1893. The children grew up knowing the chamber. They learned to descend the shaft as soon as they were old enough to hold the rope. They learned to check temperatures, to tap timbers, to sort potatoes from carrots from onions. The knowledge that Iva had fought to acquire became second nature to them, as ordinary as breathing, as essential as food. The bench continued to change around them. By 1895, every family on Cedar Draw had underground storage. The shallow surface pits that had failed in the blizzard of '88 were gone, replaced by proper cellars built below the frost line. The demonstration cellar that Iva and Travaran had constructed became a landmark, a place where new settlers came to learn before they started building. Orin Kels never fully converted. He sold his store in 1892 and moved to Rapid City, where he could profit from a larger market with less competition. But before he left, he came to the Penrose Acre one last time. "You won," he said. Eva was working on the windlass, replacing a section of rope that had begun to fray. She did not look up. "I wasn't competing." "Weren't you?" Orin's voice was bitter. "You took everything I built and made it worthless. My storage, my credit, my position on this bench. All of it gone because you decided to give away what you could have sold." "I decided to teach what I had learned." Eva finally looked at him. "That's not the same thing." "It felt the same to me." She studied his face, the resentment, the wounded pride, the stubborn refusal to understand what had happened and why. "You could have learned too," she said. "You could have built proper storage. You could have become part of what was working. Instead, you tried to tear it down because you couldn't control it. That's exactly what happened." Eva stood and faced him. "My father spent 10 years building something no one understood. I spent 2 years learning to run it and teaching everyone who wanted to learn. You spent those same 2 years trying to find ways to profit from their fear and ignorance." She paused. We made different choices. We got different outcomes." Orin stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head and turned away. "Your father built it," he said over his shoulder. "You made it useful." It was the third time he had said it, and for the first time, Eva heard something in his voice that was not quite resentment. It was almost admiration. August Krall died in the winter of 1904. He had lived through 17 more winters after the blizzard. Each one survived because he had learned to prepare. His cellar had kept his family fed through 2 more bad storms, not as severe as '88, but hard enough to remind everyone why they had learned to dig. Eva spoke at his funeral, the way she had spoken at Travaran's. "He doubted me once," she said, "but he told me they would haul me out stiff by New Year. He was wrong, and he admitted it. That took courage. That took the kind of honesty that most people never find." She looked at the gathered crowd, farmers, families, children who had grown up on food stored in the Penrose method. He learned. He changed. He built something that will outlive all of us. That's the best any of us can do. They buried him beside his cellar, the way Travaran was buried beside the demonstration cellar. It seemed fitting. The knowledge would stay close to the men who had carried it. The final teaching happened in the spring of 1923. Eva was 73 years old. Her hands were slower than they had been, her eyes weaker, her breath shorter. But she still descended into the chamber every week, the way she had taught everyone to do. A young man from a settlement near Sturgis had come to learn the method. He was building a homestead, starting a family, preparing for winters that he had never experienced but had heard stories about. Eva took him down the shaft. The chamber was unchanged, the same bins, the same barrels, the same penciled notes on the cap timber. The temperature still held steady, 34 degrees in the potato section, 36 near the carrots, 32 where the onions hung. "This is where it started," she said. The young man looked around with wide eyes. "Your father built this?" "My father built it. A Cornishman taught me to run it, and now I'm teaching you." She touched one of the cap timbers, the one she had replaced in her first year, the one that had taught her to listen for hollow sounds. "The principle is simple. The execution is hard. You have to maintain it every week, check every system. Never assume that something is working just because it worked yesterday." Every week. Every week. She handed him the spirit thermometer that Travaran had given her, that she had used for 35 years. "Take this. Learn to read it. Teach your children to read it. And when they are old enough, send them to me, or to my daughter, or to my son. Someone will still be teaching." The young man took the thermometer carefully, as if it were made of glass. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. Build your cellar, stock it properly, survive the winter." She smiled, a small, tired expression that carried the weight of decades. "That's all the thanks I need." Eva Penrose Redfern died in the spring of 1924. She was 74 years old. She had lived through 37 winters on the acre her father had left her. Each one survived because she had learned to prepare and taught others to do the same. Milo found her in the chamber. She had descended that morning to check the bins before thaw, the way she always did. The rope had lowered her smoothly. The brake had held. The lantern had lit the darkness the way it had lit it for 36 years. She was sitting against the wall beneath her father's penciled notes, her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap. The thermometer was beside her, 34 degrees, the reading she had taken thousands of times. She had died the way she had lived, checking the system, maintaining the method, making sure that everything was working the way it should. They buried her beside Milo's workshop, overlooking the shaft that had changed everything. The service was large, families from across the region, people who had learned from her directly or learned from people she had taught. August Krall's grandchildren stood beside Dileia Voss's grandchildren. The young man from Sturgis came with his wife and infant daughter. Sigrid spoke for the family. "My mother taught me that knowledge dies with the people who hold it," she said. "She spent her whole life making sure that wouldn't happen. She taught everyone who wanted to learn, and now we carry what she knew." By the middle of the 1890s, every family on Cedar Draw and its neighboring claims used some version of the method. Deep reserve where ground allowed, banked family cellars where it did not, strict separation of moist roots from dry stores. The 31 cellars were built according to the principles Iva had taught. The children who grew up on that bench learned to check temperatures and tap timbers and sort potatoes before they learned to read. The knowledge had become as ordinary as breathing and as essential. Eva Penrose Redfern lived out her life on the same acre the town had pitied. She never left it because she had turned it into the thing her father was trying to build all along. Not a farm, not a mine, but a winter-safe holding ground. In later years, she was the one younger settlers came to for verdicts on bad drainage and foolish storage. She died in the spring of 1924 in the chamber her father had built after insisting one last time on checking the bins before thaw. Return to January 12th, 1888. The wind is coming sideways. Siege of the road is gone. The temperature has fallen 24 degrees in 6 hours. August crawl's warning still hangs in the air. Keep sleeping over that hole, and they'll haul you out stiff by New Year. Now answer it. The line of mittened hands at the shaft collar. The brake drum turning, frost whitening the rope, the bucket rising from darkness, heavy with potatoes that smell of cold sand and earth. A child holding the first warm bowl that came from that lowering. That is the reply. Not a speech, not triumph. A bucket lifted from a hole everyone had laughed at. The shaft mouth in late spring, open at last, wind moving over the collar, the pulley still there. The dry well never gave them water. It gave them time.